The trunk hit the floor of Raymond Fairchild's front porch with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut, and Dorothy Keating pressed both hands flat against its scarred wooden surface as if she were keeping something buried alive inside it. "You don't touch that," she said, and her voice was not a request. It was a wall, a locked door, a loaded gun pointed at the space between them in the warm Texas evening. "Nobody touches that." Raymond stood in the doorway of his ranch house, hat in hand, watching her the way a man watches a horse that has just shied from something invisible. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent 15 years pulling fence wire and wrestling cattle through drought and flood. He was not a man easily startled, but Dorothy Keating startled him. She had arrived on the southbound stage from Amarillo 3 days ahead of schedule, which was the first surprise. The second surprise was the trunk. He had expected a woman, yes. He had arranged for a woman through the correspondence service out of Kansas City, letters going back and forth for 4 months, careful and formal and honest on both sides, or so he had believed. What he had not expected was a woman who carried herself like someone running from a fire she had started herself, eyes scanning the horizon even here, even now, even standing on his porch with her breathing too fast and her dark hair escaping its pins from the long, brutal journey. And he had not expected the trunk. It was old, older than anything else she owned, which he had noted immediately. Her traveling bag was newer, the leather soft and pale. Her hat was recent. But the trunk was ancient, its brass fittings gone green with age, its wood so dark it looked like it had been soaked in something unpleasant. 2 locks on the front. A leather strap buckled 3 times around it like a man trying to keep his composure. For 3 days, it had sat in the corner of the spare room where Dorothy slept, the room he had prepared for her as a courtesy, because he was not the kind of man who assumed, and in those 3 days, no one had asked about it. Not him. Not his housekeeper, old Maria Gutierrez, who had seen enough of life's secrets come through this part of Texas that she had learned the wisdom of looking past certain things. Not his ranch hand, Tobias Webb, who was constitutionally incurious about anything that didn't have 4 legs and a brand. Nobody asked. Until the evening Raymond came up onto the porch with a cup of coffee he had made specifically for her 2 sugars, a splash of cream, the way she had mentioned in her 3rd letter as a detail so small she had seemed embarrassed to include it, and found her kneeling beside the trunk in the low gold light, her forehead resting against its lid, her whole body shaking with the kind of silent weeping that lives deeper than sound. He set the coffee down on the railing with extraordinary care. He lowered himself to his knees beside her on the rough porch boards, and the wood creaked under his weight, and she flinched away from him like someone expecting a blow. And Raymond Fairchild, who was not a man of many words but was a man of decent instincts, waited until she had gone still before he said, very quietly, "Dorothy, what is in the trunk?" She looked at him then. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since she had stepped off that stage. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black in the failing light, and they were full of something that sat between terror and relief, the expression of a person who has been carrying an impossible weight alone for so long that the mere possibility of setting it down was more frightening than continuing to carry it. "If I tell you," she said, "you'll send me back." "I won't," he said. "You don't know that yet." "No," he agreed, "but I'm asking anyway." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She looked at the trunk. She looked at him. And then she began to talk, and the sun finished setting behind the flat line of the Texas plain, and the stars came out one by one like witnesses gathering, and Raymond Fairchild listened to every word. But to understand what Dorothy Keating pulled out of that trunk on that porch in the autumn of 1884, you need to understand where she came from, and why she had run so far, and what it had cost her to run at all. She had been born Dorothy Ann Keating in 1858 in the river town of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the second daughter of a man named Gerald Keating, who sold dry goods and believed, with the particular conviction of men who have never been tested, that the world was fundamentally fair, and that virtue was always eventually rewarded. Her mother, Claire Keating, had been a quiet, beautiful woman who pressed flowers in books and sang to herself while she worked and died of fever in the summer of 1869, leaving Gerald Keating with two daughters and no particular aptitude for raising them. Dorothy's older sister, Marguerite, had been the pretty one by everyone's accounting, which was to say she had been the one men noticed first. Dorothy had been the smart one, which in Baton Rouge in the 1870s was not considered a compliment for a girl. She had been sent to a decent school run by strict women who valued correctness over imagination, and she had learned to read well and cipher quickly, and had developed the habit of noticing details that other people missed, which had served her extremely well and cost her almost everything. Gerald Keating remarried in 1873 to a woman named Harriet Stokes, who was not a villain in any theatrical sense, but who was simply cold in the specific way of a person who has decided that warmth costs more than it is worth. Harriet Stokes Keating ran a careful household and had clear opinions about what Dorothy's future should look like, opinions that involved a man named Cornelius Vance. Cornelius Vance was 41 years old when Dorothy was 16. He was a business associate of Gerald Keating's, a man who moved money the way other men moved cattle, with efficiency and without sentiment. He wore good clothes and had clean hands and had never, to anyone's observable knowledge, done anything technically illegal. He had a large house on the better side of town. He had expressed interest in Dorothy in the circumspect way of men who have learned to want things without appearing to want them, through her father, through careful conversation, through the slow application of social pressure that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than polite interest. Dorothy had said no when she was 17. She had said no when she was 18. By the time she was 19, she had understood that no was not a door she was being offered, it was merely a window, and Cornelius Vance was the kind of man who, having decided he wanted something, would simply wait until the window was closed too. Her father was not a cruel man. She would hold on to that later, during the worst of it. He was simply a weak one. He owed Cornelius Vance money, not a small amount. The kind of amount that accumulates interest faster than a man working in dry goods can earn it back. The kind of amount that, when Cornelius Vance mentioned it in a certain tone while discussing Dorothy's prospects, sounded very much like the terms of a transaction. Dorothy Keating had married Cornelius Vance in the spring of 1878. She was 20 years old. She wore her mother's dress, let out at the seams, and she had told herself she would endure it because there was nothing else to do, because her father had needed saving, because Marguerite had already married and moved to Atlanta and was not in a position to help, because the world offered women of her station and era a narrow set of options, and she had examined every one of them and found them all inadequate. For 3 years, she had endured. Cornelius Vance was not a violent man in the way of men who use their fists. His violence was quieter and more patient, the kind that operates through control and isolation and the slow removal of all exits. He managed her correspondence. He managed her money, which is to say, he managed the absence of any money she could access herself. He managed her social life, which meant he decided who she saw and when and what she was permitted to say in their presence. He was, in public, charming and attentive. In private, he was a man who had purchased something and expected it to function precisely as purchased. Dorothy had kept her mind. That was what she would say later, to the very few people she trusted enough to say anything at all. She had kept her mind by filling it with everything she could observe about Cornelius Vance's business, because the details that other people missed had always been her particular skill, and in 3 years of careful, invisible observation she had accumulated a great deal of detail. The detail that mattered most was this: Cornelius Vance's money, the money he moved with such efficiency and without sentiment, was not always his own money. Some of it was money that belonged to other people, investors. Specifically, men who had trusted him with their savings on the promise of returns that Cornelius Vance had no intention of delivering. He had been running the same scheme for at least 8 years before Dorothy married him, and he had been extraordinarily careful about it. And he would have continued being extraordinarily careful about it, except that Dorothy Keating, who noticed details, had found the ledger. It was not a ledger he kept in his office. He was too careful for that. It was a ledger he kept in a locked strongbox inside a locked trunk, an old trunk, its brass fittings gone green with age, its wood dark from years of being moved carefully from one hiding place to another. She had found it because she had noticed, in 3 years of careful attention, that there were 2 nights a year on which Cornelius Vance developed a migraine. Not a real migraine, a performed one, specific in its timing, that required him to take laudanum and retire early and sleep deeply enough that the rest of the house could have marched through playing instruments without waking him. She had found the key in his boot. She had copied every number in that ledger by lamplight, working so fast her hand had cramped, writing on pages torn from the back of a recipe book she kept in the kitchen because she had understood, with a clarity she had never felt before, that she was never going to have another opportunity like this one. She had replaced the ledger. She had locked the strongbox. She had locked the trunk. She had put the key back in his boot and gone back to bed and lain there in the dark listening to her own heart beating, and understood that she had just done something that could get her killed. It had taken her 14 months to plan her exit. 14 months of absolute stillness, of perfect performance, of being exactly the woman Cornelius Vance had paid for, while underneath the surface she was dismantling every obstacle between herself and a door. She had moved small amounts of household money with extraordinary patience. Not enough to notice, never enough to notice, the way you drain a pond 1 cup at a time. She had built a correspondence with a woman in St. Louis who helped women in exactly this kind of situation. A network that operated quietly and asked no questions, and required only that you arrived when you said you would, and carried nothing that could be traced. She had left on a Tuesday in October of 1882, while Cornelius Vance was at a meeting. She had taken the recipe book with its copied numbers. She had taken 3 dresses, her mother's cameo brooch, and enough money to get to St. Louis. She had taken the trunk, not his trunk, her own. The one she had brought to the marriage from her father's house, old and worn, the one that had always been considered too shabby to go in any room Cornelius Vance occupied. The one that was therefore hers, invisibly, the way the things men disregard always remain invisibly yours. She had packed it with everything she intended to keep, and she had walked out of Cornelius Vance's house in Baton Rouge, and she had not looked back. She had looked forward, which was worse in some ways, because looking forward meant understanding that Cornelius Vance was going to notice, that he was going to be angry in the particular calculated way of men who do not feel emotions so much as note their implications, that he was going to look for her. And that what she carried in that recipe book, translated now to a carefully folded set of papers inside the locked strongbox inside the locked trunk, was both her only protection and her greatest danger. The St. Louis woman, whose name was Eleanor Marsh, and who operated out of what appeared to be an entirely respectable boarding house for women, had helped Dorothy understand her options. She could go to the law, but the law in Louisiana in 1882 was a complicated thing when it came to women and their husbands, and Cornelius Vance had careful relationships with several people who mattered. She could go further, send the papers to someone in a position to use them, but that would require trusting someone, and trust was a thing Dorothy had misplaced somewhere between the spring of 1878 and the following morning. She could run. That was the clearest option. Run far enough and stay quiet enough and become, over time, invisible. Eleanor Marsh had also mentioned the correspondence services, marriages arranged by letter, to men in the territories and states out west, men who needed capable women, and did not ask too many questions about where a woman had come from because they understood that the frontier was a place where people came to start over. It was, Alina had said carefully, a way of disappearing into a new life that was also potentially a real life. Dorothy had spent 2 years in St. Louis, working in Alina's boarding house, saving money, watching the door. She had written to 3 different men through the correspondence service before she had written to Raymond Fairchild. The first 2 had frightened her in ways she couldn't quite name. The third had been perfectly acceptable, which had frightened her in a different way, and she had broken off the correspondence with a polite lie about a sick relative. Raymond Fairchild had been recommended to her by Alina Marsh herself, who knew someone who had done business with a man named Webb in Tascosa, Texas, and Webb had spoken well of the rancher he worked for. Honest man was what Alina had heard. Doesn't drink to excess. Treats his animals well, which is a reliable indicator. Dorothy had written to Raymond Fairchild with the same careful formality with which she wrote everything, disclosing what she could, omitting what she could not, building a version of herself that was true in every particular she offered and simply incomplete in the rest. He had written back with equal care. His letters were direct without being brusque, warm without being presumptuous. He had written about his land, 1,200 acres outside of a small town called Silo Flat, 30 miles southeast of Amarillo, and about his cattle, and about the particular quality of the light in the Texas panhandle in autumn, which she had thought was an odd thing for a rancher to mention, and had therefore found encouraging. He had written, in his 4th letter, that he was not looking for a servant or a decoration but for a partner. That he had run this ranch alone for 4 years since his previous wife had passed. This had been disclosed plainly, without drama, which she had respected, and that he had found the aloneness adequate but not sufficient. He had written that he was not a man who required a great deal of conversation, but that he had come to understand that the absence of someone to speak with had made him, gradually, a person he did not particularly want to be. Dorothy had folded that letter and held it against her chest for a moment, which was perhaps the first impractical thing she had done in 4 years. She had written back that she would come. She had not told him about the trunk. She had not told him about Cornelius Vance. She had not told him about the papers inside the strongbox inside the trunk, or about the fact that Cornelius Vance's man, she was fairly certain it was a man, though she had never seen him directly, had been asking questions in St. Louis as recently as 6 weeks before she boarded the stage to Texas. She had not told him that she had arrived 3 days early not because of schedule convenience, but because she had been afraid to stay in any one place for the full duration of the original plan. She had arrived at Raymond Fairchild's ranch house with all of this locked inside a trunk, and had placed it in the corner of the room he gave her, and had tried very hard to be the version of herself she had described in her letters, the competent and self-sufficient woman who simply needed a new start. She had managed it for 3 days. And then the night had been warm and the light had been gold, and Raymond Fairchild had made her coffee exactly the way she had mentioned, and she had gone out to the porch with the intention of simply sitting for a moment in the open air, and she had found herself kneeling beside the trunk before she entirely understood that she had decided to do it, and the lock had seemed very small and very final, and she had been crying without sound for longer than she knew when she heard the boards creak. So, that is where they were. On the porch with the stars coming out, and the coffee going cold on the railing, and Dorothy Keating telling Raymond Fairchild the truth. She did not tell him all of it at once. She told it the way you drain a pond, carefully, watching his face for the thing she had seen in other men's faces when they processed the word husband as it applied to another living man. She watched for the calculation, the withdrawal, the careful reorganizing of his opinion of her. She had prepared herself for it. Raymond Fairchild's face did not reorganize itself. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look away from her or down at the trunk, or toward the dark horizon with the expression of a man reconsidering his arrangements. When she reached the part about the ledger and the scheme, She saw something move through his expression that was not calculation but something closer to a quiet fury, very controlled, the kind that comes from a man who has his own sense of what is and isn't acceptable and is not given to performing it. When she finished, the night was full and cool and the coyotes had started their distant conversation somewhere out in the dark. Raymond said, "Is there any chance he knows you're here?" "I don't think so," she said. "I was careful." "How careful?" "I took 3 stages and a horse and changed my name twice between St. Louis and Amarillo. I didn't use the correspondence service's address. I wrote to you from a post office in Kansas City." He nodded slowly, processing this the way he processed everything she would come to learn, which was thoroughly and without hurry. "The papers in the strongbox," he said. "Are they enough to, that is, do they prove what you say they prove?" "They prove it thoroughly," she said. "I spent 2 years in St. Louis verifying every number I copied. The women Alina knows helped me cross-reference public records. What's in that box would end Cornelius Vance's business and very likely put him in prison. Why haven't you used them?" This was the question. This was the one she had been asking herself for 2 years, and she gave him the honest answer because she was too tired finally to give any other kind. Because using them requires trusting someone with enough power to act on them, and finding a person like that requires coming out of the shadows long enough to be seen. And being seen is how he finds me. Raymond looked at the trunk. He looked at her. He said, "You can trust me." "I don't know that yet," she said, and she was using his own words back at him, which she realized only after she had said them. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "No," he said, "you don't. But you stayed 3 days before you broke, which tells me you were trying to trust me. I'd like to try to deserve it." Dorothy looked at him for a long time. The lamplight from the front window fell across half his face and left the rest in shadow, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man sitting on his own porch in the dark, waiting for her to decide. "All right," she said. She opened the trunk. The contents in the morning light were considerably less dramatic than they had felt in the dark. 3 dresses, carefully folded. A small box containing her mother's cameo brooch, a thimble, and a photograph of her mother taken in 1865. A Bible with her name written on the inside cover in her father's handwriting, which she had kept for the handwriting and not the book. A packet of letters tied with brown string, which were Raymond's letters. She realized with a start that she had apparently felt strongly enough about them to pack them alongside the irreplaceable things. A recipe book with worn covers and pages that smelled faintly of the Baton Rouge kitchen. And inside the recipe book, pressed flat between 2 pages of pound cake instructions, was the folded set of papers that had been her protection and her burden for 2 years. And at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in an old petticoat, was the strongbox. Raymond looked at the papers with the careful attention of a man who was not an expert in financial crime, but was not stupid either. He had run a cattle business for 15 years. He understood ledgers. He understood the difference between money that moved legitimately and money that moved in circles designed to confuse. He spent 20 minutes with the papers in the kitchen while Dorothy drank the fresh coffee he had made to replace the cold cup from last night, and then he set them down and said, "Who do you trust in the law, anywhere?" "Nobody specific," she said. "Alina Marsh might know someone." "I know someone," Raymond said. "He's a federal circuit judge. Name of Calvin Holt. I did business with his brother out of Fort Worth, cattle business, straight and clear on both sides. Calvin Holt rides circuit out of Dallas, and he's got jurisdiction over Louisiana because the circuit runs south. He has a reputation for not being bought. A reputation is different from the fact." "Yes," said Raymond, "but it's a starting place." This was the morning of her 4th day at Raymond Fairchild's ranch, and it was also, though neither of them would have called it this at the time, the morning on which a life began to take shape between them. She had not slept. He had not slept either. She had heard him up in the night, moving quietly through the house, and she had understood without asking that he had been thinking, which was apparently something Raymond Fairchild did on his feet rather than lying still. In the morning, he had made breakfast with the competent efficiency of a man who had been feeding himself for years, eggs and salt pork and cornbread from last night's batch, and he had set a plate in front of her without ceremony, and they had eaten in a silence that was, she noticed, not uncomfortable. She noticed this because she had not experienced an unforced silence with another person in a very long time. Over the following days, she moved carefully through the life of the ranch, finding her places in it the way water finds the shape of the ground it runs over. Maria Gutierrez, who came 3 days a week to cook and clean, assessed Dorothy on first meeting with the specific directness of a woman who has worked for enough employers to have developed excellent instincts about people. She did not say much to Dorothy on the first day. On the second day, she said, "You can cook." Dorothy said she could. Maria said, "Good. Do the bread then, because he forgets the salt," and went back to her sweeping, and that was the beginning of their friendship. Tobias Webb, who was 24 and built like something that had been stacked in a hurry, regarded Dorothy with the uncomplicated goodwill of a man who had no strong opinions about women, beyond a general appreciation for their existence. He tipped his hat to her every morning with absolute sincerity, and asked after her health with the diligence of someone who had recently been reminded that it was polite to do so, and Dorothy found him entirely bearable. The town of Silo Flat was small, perhaps 300 people, a general store, a church, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's on Fridays, a saloon that Raymond did not visit except for specific business reasons, and a stage stop that served also as a post office. Dorothy went to town with Raymond on her 5th day and was introduced to a small number of people with the straightforward explanation that she had come from St. Louis and would be staying at the Fairchild Ranch. Nobody appeared to find this unusual, which she understood was partly Raymond's social standing in the community, and partly the frontier's general policy of accepting people at the level of self-presentation they offered. She noticed, in town, that Raymond was regarded with the particular respect that has to be earned rather than purchased. The man at the general store, a wiry, precise individual named Hollis Crane, spoke to him as to an equal. The doctor, a young man named Forsyth who had come from Philadelphia and had not yet lost his startled look about the landscape, clearly admired him. An older rancher named Garrett Dole clapped him on the shoulder with the ease of long friendship. And a woman named Pearl Stanton, who ran the only boarding house and had opinions about everything, looked at Dorothy with transparent curiosity and said, "Well, you're younger than I expected," to which Dorothy said pleasantly, "I'm 26, to which Pearl said, "I meant younger than the frontier usually sends us," and smiled in a way that suggested she might be an ally. Dorothy was measuring everything, cataloging everything the way she always had, old habits. But she noticed, somewhere around the moment she turned to look for Raymond in the general store and found him already looking at her, not in the way of a man checking on an asset, but in the way of a man watching something he found genuinely interesting, that she was beginning to measure things not just for danger but for something else, something softer, something she did not entirely have a name for yet. On the 8th day, Raymond wrote to Calvin Holt. He showed her the letter before he sealed it, which she had not expected. It was careful and precise, outlining the situation without specifics, requesting a meeting on a matter of federal financial crime involving a named individual in Louisiana, noting that physical evidence was available. He had not named Dorothy. He had described her as a witness with documentation and had signed it with his own name and the ranch's address. "He'll write back within 3 weeks, Raymond said. "He rides a long circuit." "And if he can't be trusted?" Dorothy asked. "Then we make another plan," Raymond said, as if this were obvious. She looked at him. "You're not afraid of this?" "I didn't say that." He folded the letter. "I said I'll deal with it. Those are different things." She understood that they were, and that the distinction mattered. In the meantime, there was the ranch. Dorothy had not spent time on a working cattle ranch before, and she found it surprising in ways she had not anticipated. It was loud in the mornings, the cattle, the horses, Tobias calling to the two other hands who came seasonally, the dogs, and then it settled into a rhythm that was almost meditative, the large, slow movements of animals on open land, the particular quality of the Texas light that Raymond had mentioned in his letter, and that she now understood he had described accurately. It was very gold, very clear, the kind of light that shows the shape of things without sentiment. She began, without quite deciding to make herself useful in ways that went beyond the household. She was good with numbers, had always been good with numbers, and on the 9th day she noticed that Raymond's supply ledger for the cattle operation was internally inconsistent in 3 places, and she mentioned this while he was reviewing it at the kitchen table. He looked up from the ledger and then down at the page she was indicating and then back up at her, and said, "I've been doing that wrong for 2 years," in a tone of such unself-conscious admission that she laughed. She had not laughed properly in longer than she could easily calculate, and it came out slightly startled, which made Raymond smile, and the smile was, she noted, filed away, tried not to look at too directly extraordinarily good. She began reviewing the supply ledger. She reorganized the record-keeping system for the seasonal cattle count. She identified a billing discrepancy with a supplier in Amarillo that Raymond had not caught, which recovered a not insignificant amount of money. She did all of this quietly at the kitchen table in the evenings because it was something to do with her hands and because it was genuine help and because she admitted this only to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. It kept her in the same room as Raymond, who worked on his own papers at the other end of the same table, and whose presence she had begun to find, against all odds and most of her intentions, remarkably settling. He talked to her in the evenings, not effusively, not with the performed intimacy of someone trying to impress. He talked the way people talk when they are simply being themselves in a space where another person happens to be telling her about the history of the land, the particular difficulty of the previous winter, the cattle breeding decisions he was trying to make for the spring season. He asked her questions in return, real questions, the kind that required real answers, and he listened to the answers with the same quality of attention he gave everything, which was complete. One evening he asked her about Louisiana. She told him about the bayous, the particular green of the water, the sound the herons made at dusk. She did not talk about Cornelius Vance. He did not ask. But at the end of the evening, when she had gone to bed and lay in the dark with the window open to the cool air and the distant sound of the cattle, she thought about the way he had listened to her describe a heron's sound and had nodded slowly, storing it, as if it were something worth keeping. The letter from Calvin Holt arrived on the 19th day. It was brief and direct. He would be in Amarillo in 2 weeks' time on a circuit stop. If Raymond Fairchild had a matter requiring his attention, he suggested a meeting at the federal office there on a specific morning. He did not ask for details by letter, which Raymond said was a good sign. A man who can be bought usually tries to find out what he's being paid for before he agrees to anything. Dorothy held the letter for a long time. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, she could walk into a room with a federal judge and put 2 years of accumulated documentation on a table and let the whole dark machinery of it begin to move. In 2 weeks, she could potentially stop being a woman hiding from a dark past and start being a woman who had done something about it. She was terrified. Not of Cornelius Vance exactly. Of what came after. The after had always been theoretical, something she had kept at a careful distance because focusing on it required believing that she would actually reach it. The papers had been a weapon and a shield, and she had held them so tightly for so long that she was not entirely sure who she was without them. Raymond could see that she was frightened. He was paying the kind of attention to her, she had noticed, that involved accurately reading her states without requiring her to narrate them. He did not tell her it would be fine. He said instead, "I'll go with you to Amarillo." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. There was a silence. "I'd like the company," she said. The 2-week interval passed in a way that she would remember later as both very slow and very fast, the way important time often moves. She and Raymond settled into a shared rhythm that surprised her with its naturalism. She cooked most mornings. He handled the early ranch work. They met in the kitchen for breakfast with a comfortable ease that felt simultaneously like something that had always existed and something entirely new. She learned that he drank his coffee black and bitter and strong, that he read when he had the time mostly cattle management texts but occasionally history. She had noticed a well-worn copy of Parkman's History of France and England in North America on his bookshelf, and had taken it down, and he had seemed pleased that she was interested. She learned that he sang to himself sometimes while doing work that did not require his full attention, quiet and tuneless, and that he seemed entirely unaware that he was doing it. She learned that he had loved his first wife, Ellen, genuinely and well, and that her death 4 years ago from typhoid had left a gap in him that he had neither exaggerated nor minimized. He spoke of her without rawness. The wound was healed, the scar was there. It was simply part of the landscape of him. Dorothy found this, unexpectedly, comforting. A man who had loved someone well and grieved them honestly was a man with a clear map of his own interior. She could work with a clear map. She learned, in the way you learn things when you are paying careful attention to a person over many days, that Raymond Fairchild was a man of genuine and quiet decency. He was fair with his workers. He was honest in his business dealings. He was firm in his opinions but genuinely open to revision when confronted with better information. He did not bully. He did not perform. He was simply, consistently, himself, and the self that he consistently was happened to be one Dorothy Keating found she was looking forward to seeing every morning. The danger in this was something she was aware of. She told herself, "Do not get ahead of the facts. The facts are that you are a woman who came to this ranch under an arrangement that was honestly but incompletely disclosed. The facts are that you have not yet resolved the situation you brought with you. The facts are that the situation must be resolved before anything else can properly begin." She told herself these things, and continued to be aware of Raymond Fairchild crossing the yard in the early morning with his hat down against the wind, and went on feeling something she did not yet call by name. The day before they were due to leave for Amarillo, Pearl Stanton came to call. She came ostensibly to bring preserves, which she did actually bring 2 jars of excellent fig preserves. But she sat at the kitchen table with Dorothy and Maria and talked at the comfortable pace of a woman who has nowhere else she needs to be. And after a while she looked at Dorothy with the directness that Dorothy had come to understand was simply how Pearl operated and said, "You're going to stay, aren't you?" Dorothy considered the question honestly. "I intend to." Pearl nodded as if this confirmed something. "He's a good man," she said. "Not the kind that's good because he's never been tested. The kind that's good because he's chosen to be. There's a difference." "I know," Dorothy said. Pearl picked up her coffee cup. "Ellen was a lovely woman, but she was also, and I say this with great affection because I knew her for 7 years, a woman who was somewhat easy to know. Raymond could manage her entirely, and she was glad of it." She looked at Dorothy. "You are not a woman who can be entirely managed." "No," said Dorothy, "I'm not." "Good," said Pearl. "He needs that more than he knows." Raymond hired the neighbor's boy to watch the ranch for 3 days, and they left for Amarillo on a clear morning, with the autumn air sharp and cold, and the wagon loaded with enough supplies for the trip. Dorothy had the strongbox in her traveling bag, the papers next to it, and she sat beside Raymond on the wagon seat with the particular posture of a person holding themselves very carefully together, watching the flat land unspool ahead of them under the big sky. They talked during the journey, not about what was ahead by unspoken agreement. The meeting with Calvin Holt was set aside until they arrived, but about everything else. About the sky, which was the kind of blue that seems to make a promise it doesn't specify. About Raymond's plans for a new section of fencing in the spring. About Dorothy's years in St. Louis, the parts she could tell without explaining the parts she couldn't. About books, which she had read extensively and he had read selectively, but with great retention. about whether the frontier was better understood as a place or a condition of mind, which was the kind of conversation that could carry two people all the way to a town 30 miles east of Amarillo if they wanted it to. They stopped for the night at a way station, a spare but clean establishment run by a taciturn man and his equally taciturn wife, who provided supper and two separate rooms without any particular commentary on the arrangement. Dorothy lay in the dark of her small room and listened to the wind and thought about what tomorrow would require of her. She had been carrying the secret for 2 years. She had been building toward this moment for 2 years. She had imagined it many times, the walking into a room, the placing of documents on a table, the speaking of facts in the dry, precise language of evidence. She had not imagined it with Raymond Fairchild sitting in the adjacent chair. She had not imagined feeling, when she thought about him sitting in that adjacent chair, something that could only be described as gratitude of a specific and unfamiliar weight. She slept eventually and dreamed of herons. The federal office in Amarillo was a straightforward building on a straightforward street, and Calvin Holt was a straightforward man. He was in his late 50s, gray-haired and methodical, with the look of someone who had spent many decades listening to people tell him things and had developed a comprehensive appreciation for when they were telling him the truth. He shook Raymond's hand and then Dorothy's, looked at them both with level assessment and said, "Sit down and tell me the whole thing. Start from the beginning." Dorothy told him the whole thing. She started from the beginning. She put the papers on the table and the strongbox on the table, and she spoke for nearly 2 hours with the precision she had spent 2 years developing. And Calvin Holt asked questions at careful intervals that told her he was following every detail. And Raymond sat in the adjacent chair, which was exactly where she had imagined him. When she finished, Calvin Holt sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he looked at Dorothy and said, that is, Miss Keating, are you prepared to formally attest to the provenance of this documentation?" "Yes," she said. "Do you understand that if this proceeds, Cornelius Vance will become aware of your location and involvement?" "Yes," she said. "That's why I've waited until I was somewhere safe to proceed." Calvin Holt's gaze moved briefly and without comment to Raymond, then back to Dorothy. "The documentation is thorough," he said, "more thorough than most of what comes before me. There are at least 11 injured parties I can identify from the records you've provided, and potentially more. This is a significant federal matter." He gathered the papers with the care of a man who understood their value. "I'll be in correspondence with the relevant authorities in Louisiana within a fortnight. You will hear from me, and you may be required to provide sworn testimony at a later date." "I understand," Dorothy said. "In the meantime," said Calvin Holt, and he looked at her with something that might have been, under the granite professional surface, a specific human kindness, "I would recommend remaining where you are. The frontier is large and you appear to have chosen your location wisely." They walked out of the federal building into the Amarillo street, and the sun was very bright and the air was cold, and Dorothy stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her hands at her sides and felt the particular sensation of a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there, beginning very slowly to shift. Raymond stood beside her. He said nothing. He simply stood there, steady as a fence post in bad weather, which was exactly what she needed. She said, "I'd like to buy something." He said, "All right." She bought a new hat. It was a small, practical thing, dark green with a narrow brim, and she put it on in the shop and looked at herself in the mirror the shopkeeper offered and thought, "You look like a woman who has just done the thing she needed to do." Then she bought a book she had been wanting to read. Then she bought a length of fabric she had spotted in the dry goods store, a very particular shade of blue, the blue that the sky over the Texas panhandle makes when it decides to mean something. Raymond, who had accompanied her through all of this with the patient good humor of a man entirely comfortable with the pace of another person's errands, saw her look at the blue fabric and said, "For something specific." "A dress," she said, "for when I feel like I can stop watching the door." He looked at her very directly at that, the way he sometimes did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. He said, "You can stop watching the door." "Not quite yet," she said, "but soon." He nodded. He accepted this. He paid for the fabric when she reached for her purse, which she started to protest, and he said simply, "Let me." And it was said in such a way that it wasn't presumptuous, only generous, only the particular generosity of a person who wants to give something and has chosen something that means something, and she let him. They stayed 2 nights in Amarillo and came back to the ranch in the early morning of the third day, and the ranch looked, Dorothy noticed this with a small shock of feeling like somewhere she belonged. The weeks that followed were the best weeks she had spent in a very long time, which was not nothing, given the preceding 6 years. The correspondence with Calvin Holt proceeded with reasonable speed. A federal inquiry was formally opened in Louisiana. 2 of Cornelius Vance's injured investors, apparently emboldened by the knowledge that someone was finally paying attention, came forward with their own documentation. An investigator was sent to Baton Rouge. Cornelius Vance's attorney, in a move that spoke to the quality of the evidence against his client, made a quiet approach to the relevant authorities about the possibility of a negotiated resolution. The negotiated resolution that was eventually arrived at. Dorothy heard this through Calvin Holt's correspondence, which came regularly now, and with the measured optimism of a man watching something unfold precisely, as it should involve Cornelius Vance relinquishing a considerable portion of his assets to his injured investors and facing charges that, given the strength of the evidence, he was not in a position to contest. He was not looking for Dorothy anymore. He had, in the manner of a man who has lost a game and understands the geometry of his situation, turned his attention entirely to the new problem in front of him, which was keeping himself out of prison. His attorney had made this clear, indirectly but unmistakably, through the language of the legal proceedings. Dorothy was no longer a fugitive from a dark past. She was a witness whose testimony might or might not be formally required, but who was not in danger. She received this information on a Tuesday in December, 3 months and 11 days after she had arrived at Raymond Fairchild's ranch house on the southbound stage. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Raymond's supply ledger when she read Calvin Holt's letter for the 3rd time and fully understood what it said. She sat very still for a moment. Then she set the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the December sky, which was the color of slate and enormous, and she thought, "It is over. The dark past is still past, but it is not chasing anymore. It is simply behind you where things are supposed to be." She heard Raymond come in from the yard, the stamp of boots on the porch, the creak of the door. He came into the kitchen and saw her face and stopped. "Good news or bad?" he asked. "Good," she said. "It's done." "Or the important part of it is." He sat down across the table from her. He read the letter when she offered it. He set it down and looked at her. "How do you feel?" She considered this honestly, because he deserved honest answers, and she had come to rely on giving them to him. "Strange," she said, "like a person who has been holding a rope very tightly for a very long time and has now let go and doesn't entirely know what to do with their hands." Raymond reached across the table and covered one of her hands with his. It was the first time he had touched her with any intention in it, any deliberateness, and the warmth of it traveled up her arm and reached something in her chest that had been very cold for a very long time. He said nothing. He simply held her hand on the table in the winter kitchen light, and after a moment she turned her hand over and held his back. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had been carefully not looking at too directly for 3 months, the one that was clear and steady and warm and entirely without subterfuge, the expression of a man who has made up his mind about something and is simply waiting for the right moment to say so. "Raymond," she said. "Dorothy," he said. "I think," she started. "I know," he said. She laughed, that same slightly startled laugh from the first month, and he smiled the smile that was extraordinarily good, and they sat at the kitchen table with their hands joined, and the winter light coming in the window and something that had been held back by necessity and fear, and the reasonable caution of two people who have been hurt before very slowly, very completely, stopped being held back. He asked her 3 days later. He was patient, Raymond Fairchild, patient in the way of a man who has learned that things done properly take the time they take. He asked her in the evening on the porch, which had become their place in an unspoken way, the place where they talked most freely. He asked her with the directness that was simply how he was, no performance, no elaborate staging, just Raymond sitting beside her on the porch bench looking out at the winter stars and saying, "I'd like you to stay. Not as an arrangement, as my wife, as my partner, the real kind." Dorothy said, "I am not an easy woman." "I know," he said. "I have a dark past that is only partway resolved and an independent mind and very specific opinions about record keeping. I'm aware of all of that," he said. "It's part of why I'm asking. I'm not easy to manage." "Dorothy," he said, with the quiet firmness that she had learned was his version of emphasis, "I don't want to manage you. I want to be with you. Those are entirely different things." She looked at him in the dark for a long moment, and she thought about Pearl Stanton saying he was good because he had chosen to be, and she thought about the coffee made exactly right on the first day, and the hand across the table, and the way he had sat beside her in the federal office in Amarillo as if there were nowhere else he needed to be, and she thought about the blue fabric for the dress she would make when she stopped watching the door. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He took her face in both hands, gently, as if she were something worth handling with care, and he kissed her in the cold, clear night air. And it was not a timid thing, but it was not rushed either. It was the kind of kiss that knows it is the beginning of something rather than the sum of something. And Dorothy Keating kissed him back with the whole of herself, and felt the last cold thing in her chest finish thawing. They were married in February of 1885, in the church in Silo Flat, which was small and cold, and absolutely full of people Dorothy had not expected to have accumulated in 4 months of frontier living. Pearl Stanton sat in the front row with the satisfied expression of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. Maria Gutierrez cried without apology throughout the entire ceremony. Tobias Webb wore a jacket that he had clearly borrowed, and that was slightly too short in the sleeves, and looked enormously pleased about everything. Garrett Dole and his wife brought wedding food that was excessive in the best possible way. Calvin Holt, who happened to be passing through the circuit in February, or claimed to be passing through, which Dorothy suspected was at least partly a courtesy, sat in the back row, and nodded his approval when Dorothy walked down the aisle. Dorothy wore her mother's cameo brooch. She had made the blue dress, the particular Texas sky blue, in the weeks between December and February, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever made for herself. Raymond said his vows looking directly at her with the same quality of attention he gave everything, and when he said, "I will," it sounded like the most reliable statement she had ever heard. She said hers looking directly back. The spring after their marriage was busy in the way that springs on a working ranch are always busy, full of movement and noise, and the particular organized chaos of calving season. Dorothy threw herself into it with the competence that had always been her primary characteristic, managing the books and the supplies and certain correspondence with a focused efficiency that impressed even Tobias Webb, who did not impress easily when it came to things that did not have 4 legs. She and Raymond had found the rhythm of a marriage that worked the way good machinery works, not because everything is easy, but because both parts are properly fitted to each other, and each moves in consideration of the other's movement. They disagreed sometimes, which was good. Dorothy's opinion on the new fencing supplier was different from Raymond's, and she had proven correct, which he had acknowledged without drama. His opinion on the timing of the new cattle purchase had been better than her initial read of the ledger suggested, and he had been gracious enough not to say "I told you so," which she appreciated. They talked. They talked constantly, in the evenings and over meals and while working, in the way of two people who have found that the other's mind is genuinely interesting to spend time in. He told her things about the land that she stored with the same care she had always stored useful details. She told him things about herself, slowly, chapter by chapter, the parts that had been locked in the same compartment as the strongbox, and he received each one with the same patient, undramatic acceptance. She told him, one April evening when the porch was warm for the first time since autumn, about the day she had found the ledger in the trunk, about the lamplight and the cramp in her hand, and the absolute crystal clarity of knowing that she had one chance and it had to count. He listened to the whole of it and then said, with a kind of wondering respect, "You were 23 years old." "Yes," she said, "that was extraordinarily brave." She had never thought of it as brave exactly. She had thought of it as necessary. But hearing him say it, she considered that perhaps the two things were not incompatible. By summer she had become so thoroughly part of the life of the ranch that it was difficult to imagine the place without her, which she knew because Pearl Stanton told her so directly during one of Pearl's visits, which were a regular feature of Dorothy's life now and generally welcome. "That man has come alive again," Pearl said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the yard where Raymond was visible through the window doing something practical with a fence rail. "He was a good man before you came. Now he's a happy one. That's harder than good." In August, Dorothy began to suspect that something had changed, and by September she was certain of it. She told Raymond on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the early sun coming in very warm and yellow, saying it plainly because that was how they said important things. Raymond sat very still for a moment, the way he did when processing something significant. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was something between wonder and a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. And he came around the table and he held her, very carefully, as if she had become something additionally precious by virtue of what she had just told him, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him and thought, "This is what safe feels like. This is what I was trying to reach." Their son was born in the spring of 1886, a roaring healthy boy they named Thomas Gerald Fairchild Thomas, because Raymond had a grandfather by that name who he had admired. Gerald because Dorothy wanted one good thing to carry forward from her father's house, and because her father, when she had written to tell him she was alive and married and well, had written back a letter that was wet with the tears of a man who had known he had failed her and had not known how to say so. She had not forgiven him entirely, but the letter had been honest, and she valued honest things. Thomas was a loud and opinionated baby who had Dorothy's dark eyes and Raymond's stubbornness, and the combined curiosity of both of them, which meant he was into everything the moment he could move. Tobias Webb, who had not expected to be charmed by an infant, was charmed immediately and completely, and could be found on any given afternoon making elaborate faces at Thomas on the porch, which Thomas regarded with the skeptical interest of a natural scientist. Maria Gutierrez became effectively a grandmother, and no one questioned this because it was clearly correct. The resolution of the Cornelius Vance matter came finally and fully in the winter of 1886, when Calvin Holt wrote to inform Dorothy that the proceedings had concluded with a conviction on 3 counts of financial fraud, that the injured investors had received a partial settlement, and that the matter was, in every legal sense, closed. Dorothy read the letter at the kitchen table while Thomas sat in his high chair and threw pieces of cornbread at the floor with scientific interest. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept important papers, next to Raymond's letters and the photograph of her mother. She got up and looked out the window at the ranch, her ranch, their ranch, the long winter fields and the sky above them, and the horses moving slow and easy in the cold air. Raymond was coming in from the barn, hat against the wind, and he looked up and saw her in the window and raised a hand in the particular wave he gave her that was different from the way he waved at anyone else, something in it that was specifically for her. She raised her hand back. Thomas threw another piece of cornbread and said something that was probably not a word but had the energy of one. "Yes," she said to him, "I know. She made the blue dress into a different thing. Not the fabric. She had worn the blue dress many times by now, and it had become simply a dress. But the feeling that had gone with it. The feeling of making something for a future she could walk toward without watching over her shoulder. She took that feeling and she put it into everything she built in the years that followed, into the schooling she arranged for Thomas when he was old enough, because there was no school in Silo Flat, and she intended to do something about that. Into the correspondence she took up, carefully and quietly, with women like Eleanor Marsh in other cities, because she had been helped by a network, and she understood now that networks require people willing to be part of them. Into the house that she and Raymond added to in the summer of 1887, a proper study with 2 desks because 2 people doing serious work ought to have the space to do it, and bookshelves along 2 walls that were full within a month because they were both people who accumulated books. She put it into the second child, a girl born in late 1888 who they named Claire after Dorothy's mother, who had pressed flowers in books and sung while she worked, and who deserved to be remembered in the name of someone who would carry her forward. Claire Fairchild came into the world with the same roaring announcement as her brother, and was immediately adored by everyone in the household, particularly Thomas, who took his role as elder sibling with a seriousness that made both his parents work hard not to laugh. The trunk sat in the study. Dorothy had kept it, which had surprised Raymond slightly when she had first moved it there. She had explained, "I spent 4 years being afraid of what was in it. Now I'd like to have it somewhere I can see it and feel nothing in particular." He had understood that. She had eventually removed the strongbox. The papers were in the hands of Calvin Holt's office now, properly archived, and had replaced it with the things that belonged in the study: extra ledger books, correspondence files. A packet of letters, growing thick now, from the women in other cities who wrote to her when they needed to know that it was possible to build something real on the other side of a dark past. The recipe book, which she had kept not for the recipes or the evidence anymore, but because it had been the place she had hidden the truth until she could use it, and that seemed like a thing worth honoring. The trunk lived in the corner of the study, under the window, with a cushion on its lid because it was the right height to be useful. Dorothy sat on it sometimes when she was reading, which Raymond found privately very funny because the object that had been so weighted with secrecy and danger had become, ultimately, a comfortable seat, and he thought there was probably something meaningful in that. Silo Flat grew, which frontier towns did when the land was good and the water was reliable, and there were enough people of sufficient stubbornness to insist on it. By 1890, there were nearly 600 people, 2 new streets of businesses, a school that Dorothy had been instrumental in establishing, and that was taught by a young woman named Ada Forsyth, the doctor's new wife, who turned out to have a genuine gift for teaching. There was a library, small but real, partly stocked from Dorothy and Raymond's own shelves when they had doubles. There was a second church. There was a new doctor's office that was no longer also a dentist's. Raymond expanded the ranch in 1889, buying an adjacent parcel that brought the total acreage to over 2,000. It was a significant purchase, and a calculated risk, and Dorothy had gone over the numbers with him for 3 evenings before they had agreed it was sound. The risk paid off in the spring cattle market of 1890, which was a very good year for the panhandle. Thomas, who was 5 in 1891, had already demonstrated that he had inherited his mother's interest in numbers and his father's instinct for land. He followed Raymond around the ranch with the focused intensity of a very small person trying to understand something that is too large for him, yet, but not, he suspects, forever. Raymond explained things to him with the same patient completeness he applied to everything, and Dorothy would sometimes hear them out in the yard, Thomas asking a question in his high, earnest voice, Raymond's lower one answering it without simplification, and feel something so uncomplicated and pure that she did not have a word for it in any language she knew. One evening in the autumn of 1891, Raymond came in from the yard and found Dorothy at the kitchen table with the open trunk in front of her, going through it with the deliberate care of someone organizing. He stopped. "What are you doing?" "Clearing out what doesn't need to be here anymore," she said. He sat down across from her. He watched her work. She took out the packet of his letters, she set those aside. Those were staying, and the recipe book which she placed on the table between them. She took out a bundle of correspondence from the women in other cities which she sorted through, keeping the active threads and setting aside the resolved ones. She pulled out the extra ledger books and stacked them neatly. At the bottom of the trunk she found something she had forgotten was there. It was a pressed flower. A magnolia blossom, perfectly preserved between two sheets of paper. Her mother had pressed it. She could not have said exactly how she knew that. It was the paper, perhaps, the particular fold. Something about the way the magnolia had been placed as if it mattered. She sat with it in her hands for a long moment. Her mother, who had pressed flowers in books and sung while she worked and died in 1869, and had been carried forward in a cameo brooch and a granddaughter's name, and now here, in a bloom that had survived everything. Raymond watched her without speaking. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. "My mother would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "She liked quiet people. She said loud people used up all the air." He smiled. "I'll take that." She put the magnolia back in the trunk carefully between its pages. She set the recipe book on top. She put Raymond's letters in and the active correspondence and the ledger books. She closed the lid. Then she looked at him across the table and she said, "I'm glad nobody asked, until you did." He looked at her steadily. "What do you mean?" "The trunk," she said. "Everyone who passed through my life, the people at the boarding house, the people on the stages, even Eleanor Marsh, they all saw it and none of them asked what was in it. And I was grateful every time because I wasn't ready. I needed to find the right person, the right moment, the right question." She put her hand flat on the trunk's lid. "You asked gently. That's the thing I keep coming back to. You could have demanded, you could have made it conditional, but you just asked. Gently." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not an easy thing to ask gently. You could see how it could go wrong." "Yes," she said. "That's why it mattered." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too. And he put his arms around her in the kitchen with the autumn dark pressing against the windows, and the children asleep down the hall and the ranch quiet outside. And she leaned against him and let herself be held in the full and uncomplicated way of a person who has learned, finally, that being held is not the same as being contained. The years continued in the way of good years, which is to say they moved with enough richness that they did not feel too fast, but enough change that they never felt still. Thomas in 1893 fell briefly and dramatically in love with a horse that Raymond allowed him to help train, which took up most of his emotional energy for an entire season. Claire, who was 5 that year, announced her intention to be a doctor, which no one discouraged, and Ada Forsyth gave her a small anatomy text that was probably slightly advanced for her age and entirely appropriate for her personality. In 1894, a third child came, a boy they named William, who was quieter than his siblings and watched the world with an expression of patient assessment that made Raymond laugh, because it looked exactly like Dorothy thinking. William was a gentle baby and then a gentle child, which balanced the household nicely because Thomas was loud and Claire was opinionated, and a gentle child in the center of that was like a river stone, smoothed by everything around it and utterly itself regardless. Dorothy finished the letter-writing work that had begun as a private response to Eleanor Marsh's network and had grown, by the mid-1890s, into something more formal. She was not running an organization. She had no interest in running organizations, but she had become a reliable link in a chain that helped women find options in the territories, and she was known, in the specific way of people known within a small world for a specific kind of help, to be someone who understood the particular difficulties of women trying to begin again. Raymond understood and supported this entirely, which surprised her less as the years went on, though it had surprised her a great deal when she had explained it to him the first time. He had said, "Of course, what do you need?" Which was, she had come to understand, his fundamental mode of support, not judgment, not direction, just, "What do you need and how can I help?" She wrote to her father twice a year. Gerald Keating had grown old and was not well, and their correspondence had found a shape that was honest rather than close, which was the most that could be managed given what had passed between them. He knew about Thomas and Claire and William. He had asked about the ranch, and she had described it with the particular care she took with descriptions that mattered. He had written, in one of his later letters, that he was sorry. Just that, baldly, without elaboration. She had written back that she knew, and that she was all right, and that she hoped he was too. That seemed enough. Marguerite wrote occasionally from Atlanta, letters full of her children and her husband and the social life of a woman who had been successfully absorbed into a comfortable world. They were not close, had never been close in the way of sisters who understand each other, but they maintained a friendly, intermittent contact that was genuine within its limits. Eleanor Marsh died in 1896. Dorothy learned of it through the network, and she felt the loss with a specificity that surprised her. Eleanor had been a practical and unsentimental woman, and Dorothy had never thought of her as someone she would grieve. But she had been the person who had made the next part possible, who had said, "There are correspondence services," on a day when Dorothy had needed someone to say something useful, and the world without her in it was slightly diminished. She told Raymond about Eleanor that evening, and he listened and said all the right things, which with Raymond never sounded like the right things so much as just the true ones. Silo Flats celebrated its 20th anniversary as a proper town in 1897, which it did with a festival that lasted 3 days and featured what Pearl Stanton called an entirely unnecessary amount of pie, which was a funny thing to say given that Pearl had contributed 4 of them. Dorothy helped organize the event with a committee of women who by now constituted something like the social infrastructure of the whole community. Raymond judged the cattle show with Garrett Dole, who was older now and slower, but still the sharpest eye for a good animal in the panhandle. Thomas was 12 and already clearly going to be very tall, and spent the festival mostly following a girl named Nora Crane, Holly's Crane's daughter, at a safe distance, with the intense focus of a boy who has not yet understood that this constitutes a particular kind of attention. Dorothy and Raymond observed this from a distance with the amusement of parents who remember very well what it is to move around another person, as if they were a fixed point of navigation. "He has no idea," Raymond said. "None," Dorothy agreed. "I had no idea either when I was his age." "I know," she said. "That's part of how it works." He looked at her. "And did you know?" She considered this. "I knew when I bought the hat," she said. "The green hat. The green hat in Amarillo." She looked at him in the afternoon festival light, this man she had spent 12 years building a life with, this man who had asked gently when everyone else had looked past a locked trunk and kept walking. "I thought, you are buying a hat because there is a future to buy hats for." And then I thought, why is there a future suddenly? And the answer was standing on a porch with coffee. Raymond put his arm around her shoulders in the way he did, comfortable and easy. "I knew before the hat," he said. When you told me the ledger had 3 errors, the way you said it, not proud, not showing off. Just here is information that is useful to you. Here it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought, this is a person who cares about things being right. Those are the people worth knowing." She leaned against him, shoulder to shoulder, in the noise and warmth of Silo Flats celebration, and watched Thomas track Nora Crane with 12-year-old subtlety across the festival grounds, and watched Claire try a piece of pie and announce her verdict with the confidence of a small judge, and watched William sit very quietly near a dog that had clearly decided it belonged to him. "We did all right," she said. "Yes," Raymond said. "We did." But the story, her story, the one that had started in a house in Baton Rouge and run through 2 years of hiding, and one locked trunk and a porch in the Texas evening. The story had not ended neatly at that festival or at any one moment. It ended the way most true stories end, not in a clean punctuation point, but in the gradual understanding that something is finished because something fuller has replaced it. She understood it most clearly in 1899, one evening in September, when the century was almost done and the light was very gold, and she came out onto the porch where Raymond was sitting in the early evening dark, and she sat beside him on the bench they had replaced twice over the years, but that occupied the same spot as the bench where they had first truly talked, and they sat together in the comfortable silence that was the accumulated product of 15 years of choosing each other. The trunk was in the study, under the window, with its cushion. Thomas's schoolbooks were stacked on it. A pot of fall flowers that Claire had picked sat on the corner. William's small hat hung on the brass fitting that had gone from green back to something approaching bronze in the years of being touched by small hands. The papers were long since in the archives. The magnolia blossom was still pressed between its pages in the recipe book. The strongbox was empty and clean and lived in the barn now, holding nothing more dangerous than receipt copies for the cattle sales. The woman who had pressed both hands against a trunk on a porch and said nobody touches that, she was still Dorothy Keating in all the ways that mattered. The sharpness of attention, the precision of mind, the stubborn insistence on things being done correctly, the ability to carry something heavy and keep walking. But she was also Dorothy Fairchild, which was not an erasure but an addition, not a loss but a finding. The woman who had run so far to reach a place she could stand still had stood still, and found that standing still was the bravest and most interesting thing she had ever done. Raymond said, into the comfortable evening, "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the stars coming out over the flat Texas land, the enormous and specific stars of the panhandle, and she thought about heron sounds and recipe books and green hats and coffee made exactly right. "Nothing in particular," she said. "Everything." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. Thomas called something from inside the house, probably about supper, probably urgently, because Thomas experienced everything urgently. Claire's voice replied with a counterargument. William said something, quietly, that neither of them could hear but which apparently resolved the situation because there was a brief silence, and then the sound of 3 children moving toward the kitchen with the particular percussion of managed chaos. Raymond stood and offered his hand to Dorothy, and she took it and stood, and they went inside to their family, and the porch was empty behind them in the dark, and the stars were very bright over the Fairchild Ranch outside Silo Flat, Texas, in the autumn of the last year of the century, and everything was exactly as it should be. The trunk stayed in the study. Nobody asked about it anymore. Not because they were politely ignoring it the way people had once politely ignored it, but because they all knew what was in it, because it had been opened, because the hidden things had been brought into the light, where they could not hurt anyone anymore, where they had in fact become simply the beginning of a story that had a very good middle and a very good ending, and the open, unafraid possibility of everything that was still to come.